School for the City. We always say it's a school for people who already went to school. So we focus on professionals. We organize lectures like this ones, evening things, debates, symposia, but also studios or workshops, depending how you want to call it. And those are activities during which we bring together a group of people, often from different backgrounds, professionally but also culturally. And then with a group of 10, 12 people, we dive into a certain topic for a couple of days. And currently we're working on a studio that's called Protest in the City, where we are looking at different ways of protest from historical perspective, from the current perspective, but we also challenge the participants to design their own protest. And we started last week, so we started on Friday and Saturday. There we did some kind of analysis part of the protest. Some of the participants are also in the audience tonight. And tomorrow we will continue the studio and we're going to design a protest. So that's a bit of context. And in the studio we work together with Loom, Practice for Cultural Transformation. And Katia Truijen, Mark Minkjan and René Boer are the tutors in the studio, part of Loom. And they actually suggested to invite the Laboratory of Insurrectionary Imagination, also known as Isa and Jay. And since it was your suggestion to invite them, I thought it was also nice that you would introduce them.
Thank you, Mike. And applause for the school and for Mike. Yeah. So, hi everyone. I'll stand here maybe. My name is René. I'm part of Loom, and co-organizing the Protest in the City workshop taking place last weekend and coming weekend. And I thought it would be good maybe to say a few words on why we're organizing this workshop and why we thought it was interesting to invite the laboratory. But needless to say, we're beyond excited that you're here tonight and that you will share your thoughts with us. So, I mean, obviously we're living in quite difficult times. Every day when you open the news, it's quite clear that the neo-fascist right is dragging us further and further into a global poly-crisis, which is escalating in all directions as we speak. And so obviously it's also, in such times, it's also crucial to step up our game when it comes to continue to organize and to mobilize for political alternatives. And this clearly also means mobilizing for protest and direct action in real life, in public space, and in the urban environment. And at the same time, we feel that, particularly in the context of the Netherlands, that protest in urban space, more also than compared to rural space, for example, is increasingly met with repression. So, for example, in Rotterdam, we've seen violent attacks on anti-racism protests a few years ago, but also violent attacks on housing activists protesting at Erasmusbrug. Or last year, the violent attacks by the police on the Palestine encampments in different cities. But we've also recently seen intimidating house visits to climate activists in different places in the Netherlands over the last few months. Recently, a lot of new forms of like tracking, surveillance, facial recognition, drones, filming protests. All of this is quite new and intensifying, and all of it has quite a chilling effect on people who have the ambition to protest. But at the same time, also the cities in which these protests are taking place are also changing quite rapidly. So in the contemporary smooth city, urban space is often redesigned in such a way that it prioritizes consumption and it prevents any form of assembly or coming together. And in the smooth city also, the more unruly classes are also being erased and pushed to the margins. And at the same time, the smooth city also functions as this kind of overly optimistic norm machine where people have no other choice than to kind of optimize their lives and go along with this kind of norm machine. And it's increasingly harder to stand out, to act differently, or act subversively, or in general to be a political being. So we feel there's an urgent need to keep learning collectively how forms of protest and direct action can be organized, despite repression and despite smoothification. And we feel this increasingly also needs a level of collective imagination, of creativity and even design. And we feel that like thinking a bit more creatively around these forms of protest and direct action can make a huge difference. And I think it was also interesting to look at this example of what happened last weekend in The Hague, for example, at the Red Line protest. Not sure if you have noticed that, but like a very big like pro-Palestine protest in The Hague with a very simple concept, basically time to draw a red line, let's all come in like a red t-shirt, and let's get rid of all other political messaging. And I think strategically this was kind of genius. This clearly resonated at this moment in time, and also they used the right channels, so 150,000 people showed up, which is kind of unprecedented for the Netherlands, for protests in the Netherlands. I think we haven't seen such big mobilization since the protest against the war in Iraq. So something was done right. Personally, I feel that the political framing is quite awful. I mean, drawing a red line after 18 months of genocide is not very sharp, I would say, but somehow it did something. It resonated, but I also think that we can do better. So two people who have been thinking about how we can do better in more creative and subversive and artistic, but also more chaotic or transgressive ways are Isa Fremeaux and Jay Jordan. Thank you so much for coming. And they have for decades been imagining new forms of political adventure and activism with different social movements across Europe. And I think we can all learn a lot from your way of thinking, your way of acting, dreaming and working. And not just the workshop participants of the Protest in the City workshop, but I guess all of us were present and active in forms of political transformation at this day and age. So I think, it's time for me now to end here and to give you the floor. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, René. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone, for inviting us here. It's great to be back in Rotterdam. We hadn't been to Rotterdam for years, and then in the last 2 years, we've been coming a lot. So there's some kind of ley line happening, Rotterdam ley line. Anyway, this talk is called Becoming the Territory, a handful of principles for creative resistance. Prompt for AI. Make us a picture of what is happening right now. The rise of fascism, climate breakdown, soils, water depletion, poverty exploding, toxic white supremacy spreading, genocides worsening, mass extinctions everywhere, petro-patriarch feeding, misogyny, more and more wars, a global mental health crisis. Prompt for AI in full cinematic color and super realism, please. AI. No picture can describe the state we're in. No picture. We are in this very strange moment of polycrisis, as René said very beautifully. And with the rise of what we think is a very interesting term that comes from Astra Taylor and Naomi Klein, which is called end-time fascism. Who there has heard of this term already? A few people nodding. Okay. An amazing article in The Guardian. I imagine it's probably been translated into Dutch already, worth reading. What is it? What is end-time fascism? Basically, it's a new strain of fascism that is actually driven by apocalyptic fire. And we're looking right now at quite an apocalyptic kind of thing, if you haven't seen this behind. What they do is they recognize, like probably most of us in this room, that we are in a moment of extreme ecological and social breakdown. But the end-time fascists, instead of deciding to find solutions to this, are saying, no, let's keep this going because this is going to be good for us. Basically, they are keeping burning the fires so that they can create these white supremacist enclaves and bunkers where a kind of elite class will be saved. So they're building these crypto-colonialist, high-tech fiefdoms and corporate city-states around the world. City-states with AI police forces, some floating on international waters to avoid national laws. And as Klein and Taylor say, to put it bluntly, the most powerful people in the world are preparing for the end of the world, an end they themselves are frenetically accelerating. Now, perhaps you know all this already, but what the fuck? I mean, how do we resist this? How do we act in the right way right now? We've always seen activism as forms of kind of spatial and social and human and more than human acupuncture. Where do you find the right point to put your energy and that you can do as an individual, as a movement, and how do you find that leverage point to change? But right now, we're going to have to admit to you too, we're not here with answers because we're probably as lost as you are. But actually, when they say end time fascism, maybe it's not quite yet an end time, because actually we're not yet in the new time. We're more on an edge time than an end time. One of the tactics of end time fascism is that we lose our hold on reality. And we give up hope, and we're like, in English we have this term rabbits in the headlights. Do you have that in Dutch? Like, yeah? What's it in Dutch? Go on, I bet it sounds much better than us. Oh, I forgot. Dutch people are super shy. It's fine, and it's fine. No audience participation. Promise there will not. Oh, yeah, there is a bit more audience participation. And so, yeah, they paralyze us with this kind of massive stream of chaos, of news, of memes, of new words, to basically make us paralyzed. But, so we're in this kind of portal. We're in a historical portal. We're not quite in this new world, and we're not in the old world anymore, and we're on this edge. And for us, edges are really powerful. They're the most powerful place you can ever be. They're powerful because they're neither one thing nor another, and both. They're kind of non-binary. They're kind of trans spaces, and we're in that transition space right now. We've always liked these edges because in ecosystems, edges are where the edge between a forest and a prairie, for example, or between the sea and the land, is where there's the most amount of relationships between different species. And as there's the most amount of relationships between different species, you have an incredible, powerful resilience, but you also have a lot of creativity. A lot of evolutionary power happens on those edges. In fact, if we think about it, in those edges where all these different species are touching, connecting, transforming each other, that's where life begins. Life begins on the edge between the sea and the land. So we've loved edges, these non-binary spaces of potential. And there's one space that we find very useful right now, is to try and keep on that edge between utopia and apocalypse. It's so much easier right now to imagine the apocalypse. Everything we open is imagining the apocalypse, telling us we're heading towards the apocalypse. We read the science, it's telling us we're going there. But actually, we think that both having a hope for a revolution and hope for an apocalypse is a problematic thing. Because it's a binary that actually suggests that it knows what the future is. That says it's inevitable. This future is inevitable. It's already written. No future is ever, ever written. Virginia Woolf in 1915, the middle of the beginning of the First World War, the trenches, the absolute terrible moment of death in Europe at the time, she wrote, "The future is dark, which is on the whole the best thing the future can be." Now, she wasn't loving the horrors of the First World War and the massacres. What she was saying was, it's rich when it's dark, because when it's dark, you don't know what's going to come next, and that is powerful. It's potential. It's much more potential than knowing or pretending to know what comes next. And we are very... we have this book that we regularly read to kind of get us in this non-binary state of neither thinking about hope or despair, but being on this edge, which is a book by Rebecca Solnit called Hope in the Dark, which I highly recommend you all read. It's very short. It's very beautiful. And she says, the future is dark, with a darkness as much of the womb as the tomb. So, if there's one thing we want to say today is, the future is never fixed. whatever anyone tells you, the future's never fixed. And if only we could believe that in our bodies, in our body minds, if only we could truly believe that actually the power is in the potentiality of not knowing, then maybe we'd be much more resilient and much more powerful in these times of storms and terror. But tonight we're not going to talk about the future, we're going to talk about the past. And we're going to look at some of the creative forms of resistance from the past, from our work and other people's work, that we think give us some ideas to maybe what we can do in the future. But before anything, we want to do a little exercise. You, me, you.
So, yeah, before we start, we would like to invite all the people here who identify as women and have ever worn trousers in their life to please stand up. Thank you. Please stay standing up. Of the people who are still sitting, if you've ever gone on strike, could you please stand up? Thank you. Oh, some hesitation. Was it a strike? If you've ever enjoyed a weekend whilst you were otherwise in paid work, could you please stand up? Like, did you have a weekend? You were working and you had a weekend? No? Gosh, you have to really... I could carry on. It's like, have you ever had access to an independent media? Have you ever had access to information on contraception? Or have you actually used contraception? Have you ridden a bicycle as a child? So we're all standing up. Like what? There is a word that actually links us all. What would that word be for you? Just shout it out. Privilege is a good one. There's one that is more protest. We're getting there. One that is even more rights. Yeah. More specific. Yeah, resistance, all of that. Disobedience. So even more than protest, even more than resistance. Certainly privileges, but actually disobedience. You can sit down again, thank you. But it's like, really, all these rights that we take for granted, even the most banal as the right to wear trousers when you identify as a woman, actually, they were all gained through struggle and through disobedience. None of them were actually given away by benevolent authorities because we asked them nicely. And we're very, inspired by this quote by Oscar Wilde that says, "Disobedience in the eye of anyone who has read history is our original virtue. It is through disobedience and rebellion that progress has been made." And this is really something that we feel at a moment where a lot of these rights and more are being jeopardized and threatened. It's really important to bear that in mind.
So we're going to go through a few kind of principles. It's funny, actually. We've often talked about principles, and there's a friend of ours, a French philosopher you might know, Baptiste Morisot, saw our talk and was like, "I was so shocked. You used the word principle. Do you know where that comes from? It's the prince. It's the." But anyway, we didn't know that, and it's too late now. So. Principles. So, entangle the binaries or balance on the edges. So the edge that we also love is this edge between art and activism. It's a very fertile edge. This use of this world and this way of thinking that opens up imagination, that thinks outside the box, the art world and the world of activism, which actually really wants to change real things, not just the imagination. And so, and we believe that in the imagination, everything begins, and all forms of protest begin in the imagination. I mean, someone sat down and had the idea, probably a group of people, had the idea of a human chain, for example. This is Greenham Common, human chain around the base in the nuclear bases in Greenham Common. Someone thought about the sit-down protest, or probably it was an intuitive moment, but it comes from the imagination. Someone invented the boycott. The boycott came out of Irish Republican resistance against colonial, the British colonial state. Someone invented the lunch counter actions of the civil rights movement, where people of colour went into places where apartheid, from the segregation from the US, they weren't allowed to go. Someone invented the idea that you can put superglue on your hand and superglue yourself to a corporation, and then the police have to come and, if they're nice, please take the superglue off your hand. Someone invented the idea of sabotaging oil pipelines. Some people invented the idea of locking on, using tubes to block the bulldozers coming. Somebody had the idea of these special intelligent barricades that block the road from cars but open it up for people, and use incredible architectural thing. For those architects here, because I think there's quite a few, this was interesting because in the UK these were used as a protest, and then they were put in a museum, an architectural exhibition, and the police raided the architectural exhibition to get them. So anyway, we'll get to things like that later. But even the most boring march from A to B came out of someone's imagination. But for us, the key in this rise of authoritarianism and end-time fascism everywhere, the key is to really do what Toni Cad Bambara, who's an African-American author, filmmaker, documentary maker, and activist, wrote. She said, we need to make revolution irresistible. So how do you create forms that make things irresistible? And that's in a way been the question that's held us for many, many years in the lab.
And that's why we've been trying to, we have been organizing workshops and trainings and experiments, which is a term that we prefer to projects, because we claim the right to try out and therefore fail. Where we bring artists and activists together to co-design and deploy creative forms of disobedience. And during those workshops and in those spaces, there is another edge that we feel is really important to encourage. It's the learning zone. And the learning zone is that edge between the comfort zone and the panic zone. It is really like where you can push yourself and learn and invent most. And like all edges, it's always dynamic and it needs to be stretched. It's that if you always do what you're comfortable with, then you don't really get creative. And out of these workshops come tools and methodologies, like for instance, the clown army. That was merging the ancient art of clowning with direct action, and doing things like trying to join the British Army, the real British Army, and due to the chaos in the recruitment agency that those few clowns created, they were actually forced to shut it down, and so we set up our own crappy clown recruitment office just outside theirs, or when we actually recruited and trained more than 200 clowns for the protest against the G8, and where we had this absolutely magical moment where this clown covered the riot shields in pink lipsticks and kept on kissing the riot shields, and the cops just didn't know what to do, and at some point retreated. And one of the reasons actually clowns are powerful is because they are the ultimate non-binary beings. They are tricksters, they're shapeshifters, they're really these kind of agents of mutations where you never know whether they are wise or stupid, scary or funny, female or male, or everything in between. And so the clown army was a methodology of resistance that actually spread across many countries, from Bolivia to New Zealand, through Germany, France in the noughties. And if we were its parents, we were also the first deserters, and we can talk to you more about why we deserted. It also could take the form of objects that like these that were produced by a youth group to put on park benches. In Britain, you have a lot of these plaques on park benches that say, "To the loving memory of my wife." Well, this one said this bench can be used as a barricade. Or there was another one that said, "In loving memory of easy credit." And another edge that for us is absolutely fundamental is that between movements and institutions, we've always entangled ourselves with radical movements, like working as organizers in and as artists, and really apprehending organizing as an art. And for many years, it has been in the climate justice movements, like for instance the climate camps in the UK, where, for instance, against the building of the third runway at Heathrow Airport, we produced these shields that had the portraits of people affected by climate chaos and were reinforced by 2-second tents, which means that they were very sturdy to push through police lines, and very useful when we went to occupy the HQ of the corporation that wanted to build the third runway, because, as you know, a 2-second tent, you jump into it, and that's it. And as a little note, the third runway still hasn't been built, so resistance is fertile. And some of these objects sometimes end up in museums, like the shields in this amazing exhibition called Disobedient Objects at the London Victoria and Albert Museum. But that is never the point for us. There was also in that exhibition a bike, a double trouble bike that was exhibited because it had been turned into a 5-channel pirate mobile radio. But for us, in a time of historical crisis, public cultural institutions should be places of production rather than exhibitions. And what we mean is material production for resistance movements. That's what they should be for. And in this exploration of the edge between movement and institutions, we had an interesting experience in 2009, where to resist the corporate takeover of the Copenhagen UN Climate Summit, we did an experiment that was called "Put the fun between your legs, become the bike block." It was like, when you probably know that when there is a UN climate summit in a city, then all of a sudden everyone is totally concerned with climate, especially cultural institutions. So all the shows are about climate. So it doesn't last very long, but all of a sudden it's like, and for instance, during the Paris summit, there was this thing called Ice Watch by Olafur Eliasson and Minnick Rosing, where they heliported ice from the Arctic and invited people to watch that ice melt. And that was obviously to raise awareness. Well, that's what we call a typical example of extractivist art. And we don't have much time to go into details into what extractivist art, but we can talk about that in the Q&A. But Ice Watch revealed another binary that we try to dissolve, and that is between those who do and those who watch, and to actually get out of that position, that passive position of the spectator. So Put the Fun Between Your Leg was commissioned by the Arnolfini Gallery in Bristol, and by the Museum of Contemporary Art in Copenhagen. The idea was very simple: bring artists, activists, bike lovers, mechanics together and transform hundreds of bikes that were abandoned on the streets of Copenhagen for a reason that we still haven't quite determined. It's like there are loads and loads of bikes abandoned in the streets of Copenhagen, and turn them into tools of disobedience. So we would build them in the galleries and then take them out into the streets. There was a problem, obviously. The galleries were like, we can't quite weld bicycles in the white cubes. So we agreed to order shipping containers to be able to do the welding just outside. And then a few weeks before it started, I was working at the time, Jay got a call from the curator in Copenhagen. And she said, well, you know, in Denmark, there are quite specific rules about what constitutes bicycles, that there needs to be a certain length, width, number of wheels, etc. So could you send us your design so that it's being approved by the police? And so Jay was like, well, because it's a civil disobedience project, we don't quite care about whether it's being approved by the police, because it's disobedience. So, and we wrote that in the, you know, the application many times. So, and she had that amazing answer, was, oh, you're really going to do it? And for us, that really revealed so much what very often happens in institutions, is that they actually believe that art is pretending to do politics. And that means that, you know, the relationship between movements and institutions can become really complicated. So it's a very long story, but the museum in Copenhagen pulled out. And that, yeah, that really revealed that binary of bourgeois culture, which is separating idea from action. So we ended up in an incredible squat, because that's what happens. The activists save the day. And we had 200 people designing together and building day and night for the 2 weeks leading to the protest, like building these hundreds of machines, including the double trouble, and learning from birds and bees to move as swarms. So we trained together to be able to swarm through the cities. And despite the double trouble being confiscated by cops during a police raid a couple of days before the protest, where they claimed that they had found the war bikes. So if you wondered what a war bike looks like, it's that. We still managed to reach our objective, and 150 people in 13 small swarms became lures for the police to take the cops away from the People's Assembly that was made up of frontline climate defenders. And that was called by the movements from the most impacted in the Global South and indigenous communities. And despite the police that still attacked the community, the bikes managed to hold many of the police away with the horse maneuver. And many ended up as good barricades. It's like a police van doesn't work as well when you've put so many bikes under it. And so yes, we really do it. That's the point. And this phrase for us really remains one that uncovers so much truth about the world of art, and reveals the fact that there is another toxic binary. No. And so we could tell you many stories of being censored, but that's not quite the theme tonight, so we'll carry on with the principle.
And another principle is be prefigurative. So what does that mean? There's a very beautiful quote by a bunch of anarcho-feminist artists and street artists in Bolivia called Mujeres Creando. And they say, be careful with the present that you create, because it should look like the future you dream. So this is kind of what prefigurative means. It means, instead of just saying, no, we don't want this, in the act of saying, no, we don't want this, you show the world that you want at the same time. So you don't wait for the end of capitalism, the end of patriarchy, the end of colonialism, the end of dualisms. You live as if you're already free now. And I learnt this through a group in the 90s called Reclaim Streets. And then Reclaim Streets had a very, very simple idea, which was the streets are full of cars. Cars privatize the streets. All the research shows that the more cars you have in public space, the more less public that space becomes, the more privatized that space becomes, neighbors don't talk to each other and so on. And so instead of us having protests that say no more cars in the city, we were like, okay, now let's just block the streets and show what streets without the machines can look like if we just have bodies having fun. And so we would do things like put sand. This is decades before Paris recuperated this in their stupid plage thing in the summer. But we would put sand, like tons of sand, in the middle of a motorway, have a huge party, children could be playing in the sand and so on. And it was called a street party. And the idea was to have these huge parties with music and sound that would reclaim the streets from the machines. And it's direct action at its core. David Graeber says, protest is begging the powers that be to dig a well. Direct action is digging the well and daring them to stop you. So that is what direct action is about. It's about showing the world that you want in the present. And in Reclaim Streets, the key was pleasure. The key was how it has to be irresistible, it has to be fun, it has to feel, this new world, this little moment of new world that we're proposing needs to feel beautiful, you need to feel it in your body. And so one of the ways in the 90s that you did that, because we were coming from kind of rave cultures as well, was rave music and techno music. So these were huge illegal techno parties basically in the city streets. The biggest one, we started to get bigger, and then we were like, wow, why don't we take a motorway this time? We've done all the streets, we're taking a motorway. And there was like 8,000 people dancing. And during this, there was this carnival figure moving up and down the street. And we're very influenced by carnival, this moment where the world is turned upside down, where the rich become poor, the poor become rich, men become women, women become men. But also this moment of carnival, we used to say, well, the situation is, they said, the revolutions feel like carnivals. Revolutions always feel like carnivals. This world don't understand that. We're like, we're not going to wait for the revolution to be a carnival. We're going to have carnivals that feel like revolutions and become revolutions. And we had these big carnival characters that went up and down the street, and hidden underneath one of them were people with jackhammers, so hidden from the eyes of the police. So they had jackhammers, and they were drilling into the tarmac, hidden under the skirts, and they were planting trees in the tarmac. And the trees had come from a protest against a road that was going to destroy some forests and 350 houses. And this taught me another lesson, not only the prefigurative thing, but also the thing that actually audacious stories can move across class boundaries. So it was the beginning of the internet, start of use of the internet by activists, and this story of the trees being planted under the dresses went to the Liverpool dockers, they were traditional Marxist dockers on strike, very famous strike in the 90s, and they heard this story and they contacted us and said, we want to work with you. And we were like, and in a way, it was incredible, because we were a bunch of ravers, anarchists, artists, queers, radical eco-activists, communists, but not the traditional Marxist worker tradition. And they really were touched by the imagination. So it comes back to this thing of, create imaginative things. They can go across class boundaries and so on. Still me. Think like a hacker. So one principle we always have is this idea that, what do hackers do? Well, the hacking is really looking at something and saying, what could this thing also do? So we're inspired by an artist called My Dad's Strip Club, and her collective did this really beautiful hack of a supermarket receipt. basically she worked out that actually if you pass things through the supermarket thing, well, this was with a cashier before you had the robots doing it, and if you passed it through at a certain order, you could actually play crosswords. And so she just bought Nestle things, passed the Nestle things through the thing with the cashier, and then she took the ticket and was like, my God, it says fuck Nestle on it. And she talks to the cashier and goes, what's going on? This is crazy. Like, is this some kind of marketing thing? Or, and she does a bit of invisible theatre, which is kind of theatre where you have people in the crowd who are in the theatre, but they never reveal that in the theatre. So she starts saying this to the cashier, and the cashier's like, well, I don't know. Maybe I'll ring my manager. And then someone in the crowd or in the line goes, oh, but Nestle, Nestle's are really bad, aren't they? Isn't there some campaign because they're killing kids in the global south with da? And then you start a conversation going in the line. Another interesting hack, a group, Storhoven, who a group from the Czech Republic, who did this very simple hack. They basically found, I think this camera exists probably in many states in the world. The camera that during the weather forecast, you have it of the kind of landscape, and you have the weather forecast person in front of the landscape, and it's a classic kind of landscape, Dutch landscape or whatever. So they found the camera, and then they cut the cable and then rerouted the cable through a Mac using basic kind of special effects stuff that you can get for free. And on live TV, put a nuclear explosion happening. So the weather was like, oh, wow. And so suddenly there was many calls to the TV thing, and it was during a moment in Czech culture where there was a debate around nuclear power and so on. But you can also hack very simply with a ladder and a bit of red paint and turn Santander into Satan. Another principle that is important for us and that is revealed by not us but another group is put your enemy in a dilemma position. So think, in your resistance, what can you do which means that your enemy, whatever reaction, because often the action is the reaction. So what if the reaction of your enemy, whatever happens, you will win. Whatever happens, they will lose. And this is a classic example of that very, very powerful principle.
Wunsiedel in Upper Franconia, a small town with a big problem, a Nazi problem. Because for over 25 years, each year, hundreds of right-wing extremists have been coming here to march through Wunsiedel. The town feels helpless. That's why everything's a little different in 2014, because we've secretly turned this Nazi march into something sensible, Germany's most involuntary walkathon. The idea that every meter the neo-Nazis march, €10 go to an exit program aimed at undermining precisely these neo-Nazis, Exit Deutschland. The further they march, the more money is collected. In other words, with every step they take, the neo-Nazis campaign against neo-Nazis and unwittingly finance more and more defections from the extremist scene. And the best thing is, they only find out when they're already marching. At 1:48 p.m. on the dot, the Nazis Against Nazis campaign officially gets underway. For the first time in history, neo-Nazis are marching against themselves. In keeping with the walkathon, motivational posters and banners encourage the participants to keep going and make sure they don't forget what they're marching for, or rather, against. Markings on the road let the stony-faced participants keep track of how much money they've collected. And thought has been given to the right-wing radicals' fitness too. Bananas are being handed out as sustenance, so that even the most unfit neo-fascists will manage to goose-step their way across the finish line in this donation run. At 3:28 p.m, the neo-fascists have reached their goal. €10,000 for the neo-Nazi opt-out initiative, Exit Deutschland. €10,000 to help right-wing extremists safely defect from the right-wing extremist scene, personally collected by right-wing extremists. Thank you to all the helpers and sponsors. Thank you to the neo-Nazis for collecting donations. Thank you for the miracle of Wunsiedel. Wonsiedel in Upper Franconia, a small town with a big idea.
And on a very different level, it's clear that we're in a moment of grief, of collective grief across the world for many, many different things. And grief, like any emotion, if it's blocked in our body minds, it becomes toxic. So how can that grief itself become not something that blocks us and paralyzes us, but how can we actually transmute it, how can we channel it into forms of resistance? And there's a kind of there's an interesting tradition within queer movements of this, where sharing collective grief as a form of direct action and also a form of remembering. So there's the Transgender Day of Remembrance, which is on 20th of November, which is to honor all trans folks that have been killed by transphobia or hate crimes or illness or substance abuse or misogyny or institutional and legislative violence and murder. And the idea is to have a day where the community and their accomplices and allies meet together. But this day was kind of partly inspired, I think, by all the work of ACT UP, who were the coalition against AIDS in the 80s and the 90s. And in 92, they did an incredibly controversial action where the protesters outflanked the police and they marched to the White House lawn. And there, on the White House lawn, they scattered the ashes of their lovers who had died of AIDS-related.
Bring the dead to your door! We won't take it anymore! Bring the dead to your door! We won't take it anymore! Bring the dead to your door! We won't take it anymore! Bring the dead to your door! We are taking our long back to scatter on the White House lawn. This is an angry funeral, not a sad one. The quilt makes our dying look beautiful. It's not beautiful, it's ugly, and we have to fight for our lives.
Come to one of our last principles, which I think is one of the hardest. It's become the territory. It's something that I think we are finding very, very difficult, and I think we'll explain a bit why it's difficult, but we want something we believe is very, very crucial if we want to defend life. So we spent years and years trying to be on this edge between activism and art. But we realized there was one thing missing: everyday life. The kind of classic avant-gardes of Europe in the turn of the last century, from Dada to Situationism, via Surrealism and so on, had this kind of holy trinity, that you had to have a merger between everyday life, activism and art. we'd done activism art really well, but we ended up, after every action, after every camp, after every summer school, after every workshop, going back home to our everyday life, living in this metropolis, living in London, and reproducing the patriarchal colonial capitalist empire by having a loan on a bank, having a house, having full-time jobs in the academy, but still neoliberal academy. And we were living on the edges of the financial district, which is a very interesting edge, because it's an edge where we also realized it's an edge which had the biggest Bangladeshi community outside of Bangladesh living in it. And you just literally go from one street to another, and you are in some of the richest places in the richest banks and so on of the world. And we realized that it was very hard for us as cultural workers, whatever, living in a on this edge without being part of the bulldozer of gentrification. And we really had that experience very within the 10 years of we lived on this edge. We saw how we were becoming a bulldozer of gentrification, and even though we were taking part in amazing struggles against gentrification, such as this, where a multimillionaire wanted to buy up this cafe that was a kind of community cafe, and he wanted to turn it into luxury flats, and his wife wanted to turn it into a community theatre because the people of the youth of the area needed to understand Shakespeare for everything to be good. I mean, just like, you have no idea of the youth of this area. Anyway. We were involved in movements such as the movements against this form of gentrification, but we in the end felt that living in the city was not possible for us. There was too much cognitive dissonance. And so we went on a journey in 2008 across Europe to visit and experience autonomous collectives. And it was a project called Path Through Utopias, came out with a book and a film at the end. And the book was a kind of travel essay about our experience of these different utopian communities, and the film was a fake documentary, as if there'd been an economic and ecological collapse, and this was how people lived. We basically went to visit 11 different places, ranging over 7 months. And at the end of this incredible journey, we were very inspired by all these different forms of life that were living without domination and despite capitalism, ranging from big industrial factories occupied by their workers who were then running the factories in Serbia, to squatted villages, to anarchist schools, to free love communities, different communities. But we were super inspired by it all. And we ended up leaving our jobs, leaving the city, and moved to rural France to set up a school of art and activism. But there was still something wrong. We were still inhabited by the metropolitan bug, which is the bug of hypermobility, which is this bug within all the cultural world, which tells you that, you have value if you move. And even though we haven't taken a plane for 20 years together, and we've always taken trains, we were always still in this process of moving, being invited to conferences like this one here, and realizing that it's very useful for the system to basically put all these radical thinkers into a situation where they don't actually have hold of real places and real things. They're constantly on the move from the same biennials, the same cafes, the same art exhibitions, the same conferences, and so on. And they don't have a hold. Has less hold on transforming the world. And in the cultural world, your CV, if your CV says, I've had a show in Buenos Aires, in Delhi, in New York, and Berlin, then you have a great CV. If you say, I spent my entire life in my neighborhood, studying the relationships between people in my neighborhood and the more than human species, for example, in my neighborhood, then your cultural career is fucked. And so we we were invited to Hamburg for a big festival to do a big project. It was bringing art and activism and permaculture together. We did a workshop called Think Like a Forest, where permaculture, art and activism came together, working with precarious youth, and out of it came a show, a kind of theatre show, that begins on a stage. Now, whenever we are invented theatres, we begin on the stage, but we then transform the stage into assembly space. So we immediately break that binary spectator-actor and invite everyone onto the stage, and we have an assembly. And in this instant, we had an assembly to discuss a question, which was it ethical that we would leave the theatre afterwards and we would put the pheromones of these ants that are called the crazy raspberry ants, that basically are attracted. They have two queens, very cool. They have two queens and therefore need to find many different types of nests, and they're attracted to electronics, and they go in and they basically screw the electronics and blow up. They've actually shut down airports in the US, in Houston. And so we presented these raspberry ants to the audience and said, is it ethical to take these out and put them into the banks in the city of Hamburg that are funding fossil fuel extraction? And then we had an assembly about it, and they said yes. So we went out in our edible costumes. We made edible costumes, growing edible costumes, and we went out into the city streets with the pheromones and sprayed them into the banks. But there was another species we like to work with, which are mushrooms. Mushrooms which recycle death, that are really incredible beings. Some mushrooms have 23,000 different genders. And we wanted there to be the curtain of the theatre, we wanted it to be a mushroom curtain. So we worked with an amazing mushroom artist called Catherine Ball and made the curtain. We basically put the curtain up, and if anyone here's grown mushrooms, for 10 days you don't see anything, and then you have this little pin, and the mushroom goes doop. And then once it's pinned, then 3 days later it goes vroom, and you've got the big mushroom. And we basically wanted this kind of curtain of mushrooms that then the audience would eat the mushrooms before going to put the ants in the banks. They weren't magic mushrooms; they were oyster mushrooms. The mushroom pinned, and then they were like, there was a heat wave in Hamburg, and the mushrooms were like, we're not coming out. It's way too hot out there. You've got your cultural timetable. We've got our natural timetable. We're not coming out for your fucking theatre show. We're staying in here. And so we had the biggest, most expensive moldy curtain ever. And it was the whole project was a bit of a disaster, I have to say. Lots of problems in the project. And we got back to where we were living at the time, this ruined farmhouse in Western France where we deserted from the city to go there. And at the time we were living in this tent because the farmhouse didn't have a roof. And we opened the door of the tent and we saw this. And we're like, okay, there's mushrooms all over the roof of the tent. So we couldn't grow the mushrooms on the theatre stage. They're growing here. What is the lesson from the mushrooms? What are they trying to tell us? And clearly the mushrooms were trying to tell us, become the fucking territory. You don't need to go off and have these big budget shows and these big theatre projects in Hamburg. You can be here, you can stay here, and we can grow for you. So it was another reminder to how do we try to entangle ourselves into a place. And it pushed us to go here.
And so, yes, we ended up in this squatted farmhouse that is at Bang, where the French government wanted to put a new international airport for the city of Nantes, and basically concrete over 1,650 hectares of bocage, that's very specific landscape. And initially, the project started in the 60s, and that infrastructure project was resisted by local farmers who already knew that you don't concrete over nourishing land for stupid infrastructures like that. And then in 2009, during the first climate camp in France, inspired by the climate camp in Britain, there was a letter written by inhabitants of the land that invited people to come and squat the empty farmhouses and land that had been bought off by the government, and that said beautifully, to defend the territory, you need to inhabit it. And therefore people responded to their invitation, and after the climate camp folded its tent, a handful of people decided to stay, and that's really when the slogan against the airport and its world, against everything that it represents, really came into being, and that the ZAD, this urbanistic administrative term in French that means zone à aménagement différé, which you probably have here too, which is a piece of land that is earmarked for a big piece of infrastructure and over which nothing much happens during the time that the project is in the making. Well, that was the ZAD that was started, so it became the ZAD in 1974, and in 2009 became the ZAD, the zone à défendre, the zone to defend. And it really became like a laboratory of commoning that emerged over these hectares, with at its peak more than 70 living spaces and 400 people, which for 6 whole years existed without any police stepping into it, any judges, any elected officials. I don't really have the time to explain to you why. I'll be more than happy to do that during the Q&A. But that was really the experience, is that basically living through a territory where you try to take back everyday life into your own hands and break these deep separations that and try to explore the edge between art and everyday life, between resisting the world and building a new one at the same time, between what is a home and what is a barricade, between life and activism, with radical camembert that are made from squatting and disobedient cows, between the useful and the beautiful, such as building a lighthouse at the very place where they wanted to put the control tower, and to say actually what we want and what we need is an infrastructure that can defend this territory, alert the world about the dangers and welcome people to port, not something that is aimed to control. And despite eviction attempts through massive military operations, and despite the fact that they destroyed farmhouses and collectives in 2012, there was this energy to rebuild every time, and to also have been supported through the farmers that initially resisted and kept on the mobilization. And actually, when you fight a territory together with left-wing farmers, we saw that there were these mobilizations by farmers, like these are very, very radical left-wing farmers. You actually see what the tractor can do and how a great tool of resistance it can be. And for instance, they encircled a hamlet that had been rebuilt in one weekend by people defending the ZAD to protect that hamlet from government's bulldozer. We also move these enormous structures during evictions to replace the gathering halls that had been destroyed, and actually always felt like the best kind of theatre ever. We also had amazing rituals, such as when 40,000 people came to the ZAD and planted sticks in the ground, making a pledge to return and pick them up again if the government tried to come to build the airport, which they never did. And actually in January 2018, after over 40 years of resistance, the airport project was cancelled. And that for us is something that is really the most inspiring thing, the most beautiful thing, is that there will never be an airport on these wetlands through this incredible coalition of various people resisting and being so creative in the forms to find. And what we have been doing since is actually joining up with another art lab called H, another duet, and to set up the CAR, the Action Ritual Cell, to co-design community rituals to heal the community, because also that kind of resistance and that kind of military operations traumatizes a community very deeply, and there's also been very, very strong rifts and conflicts. And so we do that to heal the community, to celebrate the seasons, to protect the new buildings that are being built on the ruins of what had been destroyed by the cops. And we basically find these new ways of re-anchoring or re-anchoring regularly in this territory. And to finish, there is a final principle that we find is immensely important, and is to never disentangle ethics and aesthetics. Because that's something that is that we found a lot of inspiration from the Mary Wollstonecraft, who theorized that. So Mary Wollstonecraft is the mother of Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, and she wrote in 1792 one of the earliest European call for women's equalities. But she also wrote aesthetics theory, and a very forceful critic of the new moves at the time towards this very contemplative and aesthetic and disinterested aesthetics that really separated taste from particular interest in life and everyday sensual pleasures. And one of the things that she pointed out was the fundamental paradox of the ruling classes that prided themselves for their refined taste, but could also at the same time being so cruel and exploitative. And she, for instance, had this very pointed criticism of the bourgeois women who, she said, could exercise their tender feelings by the perusal of the last imported novel, yet ordering their enslaved servants to be flogged or beaten. And the same was true for her, for the elite estates, which were seen as these sublime, picturesque objects for the eyes, and yet totally hid from the imagination the distress of poverty, which he called the distress of poverty, like the evicted commoners, the hours of hard work from the laborers to be able to produce these beautiful places. And for Wollstonecraft, a landscape could only be truly beautiful if its form was a reflection of justice and happiness. And she imagined, in that sense, a countryside that would not be cultivated by exploitative land workers. And that, we felt, is not is a vision that is not a million miles away from our life on the ZAD and the fight for the commons. And we feel that really never disentangling ethics from aesthetics is really a principle that should be at the core of any action. and we'll leave you with this for the moment. Thank you very much. Oh, and I think that's the advertising break. Do you want to say?
Yeah, if you want to hear more about the ZAD, our last little book is called We Are Nature Defending Itself, Entangling Art, Activism, and Autonomous Zones. Yes, I just remembered the title.
They didn't write it.
Wow. Okay. Thank you so much for this super powerful lecture, I would say. I had a question that's maybe like, I don't really know how to ask it, but all the time I was wondering, like, wow, all this work. I'm not sure like what was yours, but it kind of came. I think I got a feeling of it, like what you were involved with and what were historical examples. But it was all the time I was thinking like I think there's a lot of people in the audience that are, in one way or the other, through their own work, through their own studies, through their own, I don't know, day-to-day life even, are trying to fight the system, trying to make a change, trying to do something else. And I was thinking like, I don't know, the question is maybe twofold. So on the one hand, I was really curious, like, how did this all started? And the other question is, maybe in line with that, is like, what would you advise like people to do? Like how to take up action and when we're all stuck in this world where we both want to make a living and kind of are angry.
So how did it all started? Well, I don't know what is it. So I
Well,
can
I
tell
don't know,
you
like
that
where you are now, I guess.
the Laboratory of Insurrectionary Imagination started with us meeting, Jay coming from a background that I'll let them explain, and my interest in popular education and the idea that actually this absolute conviction that people have the knowledge and the capacity to change their lives. Is just a matter of finding the spaces so that capacity comes through and that it's always collective. I think that one of the things that is crushing and that is paralyzing is when you are on your own watching the news and think, what could I do? It's like, well, by yourself, it's pretty likely that you're not going to be able to do very much unless you're in a kind of amazing hacker, maybe, that works. And even hackers work in networks. So I think that for us, one of the things with the lab was to actually say, well, like, how do we build these collective spaces that basically merge the creativity and the imagination and the capacity to think laterally from the artists. But often artists tend to have a big ego because they've been trained like that, and not that much courage because they've been trained like that. And it's like, how do you bring all that imagination with the courage and the audacity of activists that have a tendency to always repeat the same forms? Because what we found is that when you have these synergies, is that really you have dynamite coming. So that's how the lab started. And I think that to the question, what can I do? I would say, like, that's one of the things that we said at the start, is like, to be honest, we're not quite sure. But I think that it's definitely connect with other people, bring collective power. And I think also, how corny as it may sound, and this is one of the things that we try to show, is believe in the capacity. First of all, remember that all of what we think as progress not only started as disobedience, but it started as a really fucking crazy idea. Like, you know, the idea that that women could vote, that you know, that some people were not lesser than others. It's like all of that, you know, slavery should be abolished. That all of that started in some minds, and people were like, yeah, well, that's not possible. You know, that's just the way it is. It's that, and actually had the courage to keep going. And so when we have what seems like crazy ideas because it's not possible, because it's too late, because, you know, we'll never manage, is that we are here because we are all the inheritors of people who had the courage to not think that. So it's also a bit our duty to be like, well, that's a bit mad. Let's be a bit crazy. Let's think that actually we can change things, because this is where we all come from. So that's, I think that would be one of the many things.
And I think the work, you know, I mean, the system is incredibly well designed so that we don't have any spare time to do anything, especially not resist. I think one of the key things is, you know, how do we create material structures where we are breaking the kind of existential individualism of capitalism and patriarchy and colonialism, and managing to live more collectively. So we live collectively, and it's much cheaper. I mean, we were also squatting for many years, but we've just come from Comrade Selch Balamir's project, the Nuament in Amsterdam, which is a very cool project, which is basically enabling 50 people to live, some collectively, some individually, but in a massive collective space with, reasonable rent. And that's, you know, a project that Selch and two other friends of his had the idea sitting around eating pasta in the ZAD, and now, I wish I had a photo of it, but it's incredible. It's this huge building with a cafe and a workspace and these flats, and I mean, it's beautiful. It's really beautiful. So also find ways that to spend less money, therefore have to spend less time working and more time imagining other futures. And I think the other thing is we just welcomed some really interesting Chinese anarchists to the ZAD a few weeks ago. It was like, wow, like that's, you know, you're living in the most surveyed country in the entire world. How are you an anarchist there? And they have this incredible movement, which I think we can learn a lot from, which is called the Tang Pinist movement, which is basically the person lying down. And their whole form of resistance in ultra-authoritarian times is basically not to reproduce the system, to basically just to withdraw your labor, withdraw your participation in the system, you know, and finding creative ways that you don't have to actually reproduce this system. So they set up mutual aid spaces, so in all their studios, and they use art as a shield here. So the Chinese state think they're artists, which they are as well. And so in their exhibition spaces and their studios, they set up beds and stuff so that people can go from city to city and stay there for free. And so they've set up all these, and they've done food stuff, so all these structures that enable people to basically not have to participate. So I think, you know, that's also I think that has resonance here as well. And it's amazing. I mean, they said the only place there aren't CCTV cameras are the toilets. So they've repoliticized the toilets as well, and they put kind of radical literature in the toilets and stuff, which is pretty amazing. So yeah.
Yeah. You wanted to add something, or let's go to another question, or comment, or yeah.
Hey. I was very curious because I actually read the book, and I was wondering how about now? How is it going now? Is it still existing? And yep.
It definitely still exists. It's about 180 people that are now on that we still organize collectively. So there are monthly assemblies and working groups and negotiating with the authorities to be able to legalize. And we had very interesting workshops so the airport was cancelled in 2018, and we started negotiations were basically kind of forced into legalizations. They cancelled the airport in January, said all those who are legal or are prepared to legalize will be allowed to stay, and all the others will have to leave or be evicted. So basically, all those who had come on the invitation of local people had to go, except for those who would be prepared to actually become normal farmers. And so we said, well, no one is going to leave. Like, you know, if you want, we proposed a legal lease, global lease that was legally totally solid. We're just like, well, you want us to be legal? We sign this, you sign this, we're fine. So the answer came in the form of 3,000 cops and helicopters and drones and tanks and 11,000 grenades being thrown in 3 days in April. So there was very much a revenge of the state, like, you know, like as David Graeber, who had that amazing definition of direct action, he also said, well, actually, you know, the authorities can deal with you protesting. They can deal with you demonstrating. They can deal with you saying no. What they can't deal with is you demonstrated that you don't need them, that actually you can live without them. So for that, you have to be punished. And so, you know, after several days of incredible destruction and violence, they came up and said, well, if you sign that document that says that each individual who signs it will be allowed to stay, you can stay, and all the others will have to leave. And so we hacked that document. We made it into a file that demonstrated what commons are like, which is like, well, you can, okay, you want names, we'll give you names, but we are all entangled. So, you know, the way this doesn't work is a name, a project, and a few plots of land. Is that actually we are all totally entangled, and that has been the beginning of a long process of negotiations and legalization. And we had a workshop a few years afterwards with experiences in Europe that had gone through legalization. To see what was the impact, and there were actually squatters from the Netherlands who were like, well, it's, you know, you gain some, you lose some, but we're still there, and so we're in the process of having this legalization, and we're still being attacked by also some of the local authorities that are actually attacking us on planning permission grounds. So, you know, it's this very insidious way of actually destabilizing us. Like, they no longer send tanks now. They say, oh, you don't have planning permission, we may actually give you massive fines. But we're still standing and holding together and fighting back. So, and there are loads and loads and loads of different activities. So a lot of farming, but also there is a library, there is a whole wood carpentry and forestry activities. There is a blacksmith, there is bread, there is a brewery, there's like, so it's still a very alive territory.
And where we live it's called La Rolandière, was one of the first where we managed to, we wanted to buy all the land collectively, because the only way you can have commons in France is by actually owning the land, ironically. So we wanted to buy it collectively and raised 800,000 euros in a foundation, and the state said, no, we're not selling you anything. And then people have been negotiating. Isa is a very good negotiator. She wears these guillotine earrings for negotiating. It works very well. And with the state. And managed to negotiate them that they sell us our collective buildings. So we are going to now be renting our housing, but for very cheap, really super cheap. But the collective buildings are now belong to our collective, to the assembly, and they're going to be decided through the assembly. And we were very pleased that when our building was sold, our building is half where we live, and the half is the library and the welcome centre. And there's a gangway that leads from the library to the lighthouse, to this working lighthouse that we built. And we wanted to link the lighthouse and the library because we're inspired by mythological cities, and Alexandria has a lighthouse and a library, so we wanted to link this mythological thing. And the act of selling, the act de vente, the contract for the sale of it to us says the farmhouse with a welcome centre, a library, and a gangway leading to a lighthouse. So we're very happy that we've now officially a lighthouse, thanks to the legalization, with no planning permission. So we may have to one day do a project to show that it's either a piece of art or it's a piece of heritage, of resistance heritage, and therefore they can't destroy it. But touch wood, that's not going to happen, but we'll see.
Maybe someone else. Let's go to René first. What word was there?
I can quickly respond to this, but no, I think this is very interesting, and I was wondering, so really some of the excitement around the Zad was of course the resistance, but also the victories and the rituals and the performances and this collective joy that was happening. And now when you're negotiating and making contracts and having to pay rent, and even though it's little, and the need for making more agreements internally, like how do you make sure that this kind of joyful resistance keeps being part of Lazat? Or do you think that's possible at all?
One of the ways we do that, I mean, there are several levels, but one of the ways we do that is to make sure that we remain a base for other struggles that can, so because it's it's not just a very large territory, but it's 40 years of experience and infrastructure. So we actually have buildings and collectively incredible knowledge. You know, it's the kind of place where if you say, well, we need to have a camp for 3,000 people, and people on the side are like, sure, like, you know, what do you need? Do you need cooks? Well, can cook. We can, you know, we have the marquees, we have the buildings, we have, you know, there is that knowledge and that capacity, and I think that's something that is really important. And it's not just the infrastructure, but it's also the experience. And it's not to say we are the expert in how to win, but we can actually still share and offer spaces to exchange also like strategies to fight. And I think that's really important, and to still feed and be fed by other struggles, I think, is how you remain alive. So, and more for like the community to the community, there is still a lot of porosity with other territories. So a lot of parties, a lot of concerts, and we organize rituals, and that's one of the things that we have. That's one of the forms that we have been proposing to celebrate that heritage, that legacy of the struggle, and celebrate the fact that we are a community that is alive and that is, you know, that has joy in remaining alive.
Thanks so much for all the principles and all the imagination, and I think a lot we also bring to the next days and to the workshop. one question that we were also discussing a bit earlier, and also what René was saying about the increasing repression of like possibilities for protest in the city, is I was thinking we are the city defending itself is a question that we will be also exploring further. So I'm also curious maybe how the porosity maybe between the space that you are invested in now for so long, how that is then again also affecting maybe more urban territories, or like, how to bring it back to the city. Maybe that's the question.
I mean, it's interesting. So, you know, when you build an airport, it's an airport for a city.
Yeah.
You know, little villages don't get their airports. And so this was an airport for the city of Nantes. And like all airports, it's 20 minutes from the city centre. So we're actually 20 minutes or 30 minutes from the city centre. So we're a kind of edge zone. We're not in the middle of the mountains or it's a wetlands that would have been destroyed, but it's a beautiful wetland with a lot of quite rare species in it. It was against the EU water laws to build this airport as well, so it's a very important space for hydraulics. So, but the fact that we were on this edge between the city and the countryside was also very powerful. So, you know, there were people, you know, it could be much more, there was fluidity of people from different struggles being able to come. You know, you can get a tram, someone can come pick you up. So it's less this kind of binary countryside and city. But, you know, we were quite influenced by me more so than Isa, I would say, and we have a bit of a difference over this, but by a book that was very important in the kind of French radical left called The Call, which came out in around 2005, which is by the same bunch that did Tikkun and did the Coming Insurrection and so on, these quite famous books in that period of French thinking about resistance, and that their book, which comes from they're kind of post-situationists, and it comes from and they very clearly said in this book, you know, the city is a place that is constructed by capital to reproduce capital, and it's impossible, you know, the surveillance is everywhere, and it's impossible to. They said, you know, it's impossible really to resist in the city. You have to desert. So we were when we wrote the book about utopias, we were quite influenced by that. We really wanted to desert. But what was interesting, when we first deserted, we weren't on the ZAD. We ended up at the other farmhouse, which was quite a long way from the big city. And suddenly we were fighting, you know, a 4-lane motorway project. And normally you would go to a meeting in the city and you'd have 50 people in the meeting and there'd be a load of energy. And there would be like 4 of us sitting there going, oh yeah, we've got this 4-lane, that's 1 lane each, isn't it? Okay. And that was an interesting moment where we're like, oh, we're so used to the energy of the city in terms of resistance. So that was one of the reasons we moved back to the ZAD, to have that. And it's interesting, and the Chinese comrades that we met, they all live on the edges of the cities, these places called the urban villages. So in China, you have the cities which are expanding rapidly, and they're basically engulfing all the villages. And basically, the villages still have collective land structure forms, and the cities don't, mostly. And so you have this sudden kind of strange zone, and again, a kind of edge zone, non-binary kind of space where it's kind of some of the village traditions, but then the city's encroaching in it. You've got the artists and the activists coming out because it's cheap to live, and they say that's where their resistance is really strong. So I think it comes back to the edge, and also, you know, there's a lot of, I mean, we're not urbanists, you're the urbanists and stuff, but, you know, there's a lot of, you know, even the city-country is a binary. And recently I was reading an article about phosphorus, the peak phosphorus, and that actually, you know, even the way and you have the azot, the nitrogen issue in the Netherlands, big cities and the way that industrial agriculture is set is not sustainable, we know that. So it's going to have to be a more decentralized form of living anyway, which involves food production. There's no doubt about that. So this binary city and country it's going to have to end anyway. It will end. It can't remain.
So when they say that we don't really agree, one of the things that I feel very strongly is that calling for desertion is not enough, because Because even if everybody from the city deserts, then what do we have? So we have a completely fucked up countryside, which is already in a really bad state. So I really feel that, like developing those edges is really important. And one of the things that, like on the ZAD, when the airport project was initiated in the 60s, those who started resisting were farmers that were actually called the worker farmers, that were actually had already identified that the farmers have a tendency to organize in trade unions as though they were a homogeneous and unified bunch, and they were saying, well, we're not. It's like there is a massive difference between day laborers and those who own land. So we actually need, us, the precarious farmers, we need to make links with workers. And actually, those who started organize against the airport were also those who had who were feeding the first occupation of a factory in May 68, which was in Nantes and was already a plane parts factory. And I think that there is, it says a lot, is that those who actually are able to see those edges, because by seeing the edge is also the capacity to be much more creative in thinking the us and them. And I think that the us and them, the city country, is one that is stupid and really toxic, actually. And I think that there is a lot of work to do to destroy that kind of us and them between the city and the countryside. And at the same time, if I agree that the city is built by capital for capital, I also want to believe that there is still space for resistance inside, and that and that there is still space for collectivity and imagination and creativity and actually and finding ways. And I think that it all comes to renewing the forms all the time, and it's like one of the things that I discovered, like for me, one of the very strong experiences in the clown army was to see the cops literally the first time they saw clowns in front of them in the stage. They had they were really like this. They were just like, they had no idea how to react, and that of course dissipated. And it's like, and then we could hear them on the radio being like, oh, they're doing the sock, I repeat, they're doing the sock. So when they know even how your thing works, it's like then you reinvent something else. And I really believe that that's a possibility, that there is something there.
Maybe one there, and then I think we'll continue the rest with a drink at the bar.
Thank you for this really inspiring talk. My question was related to one of the principles, which was like to channel the power of grief, and also something else you said, which was about like a revolution that feels like carnival, or a carnival that becomes like a revolution, and this like joyful resistance. And how do you, like in your experience, how do you blend the two without it kind of clashing or offending each other? And I'll give you two examples that I've recently experienced where I felt like these kind of ideas clashed, which I think one was in an encampment where I was at, and it was a general assembly. This is, by the way, because I feel like there's a lot of grief in this one, and also because this is specifically about the Palestinian movement right now, because there is a lot of grief. And in this encampment at this assembly, someone was saying, basically, there was a vibe that some people were saying, we're having too much fun, basically. It's too, we should not forget why we are here. This is a very serious situation that we're in, and this is a serious protest, and basically it was too gezellig, as we would say, maybe. too cozy, fun, like kind of in this encampment. So that was one instance, and then another instance, which is also actually about the Rode Lijn protest, and there's a lot of reasons to criticize that protest. But there was at the end, they had the program. There was music to be played. I think it was disco arabesque or something. Anyway, there was music program at the end, and some of my more radical comrades were like quite offended by it because they said like, oh, you know, it's already like such a liberal protest, and now they're also making a party out of it. Like this is so like, you know, it's so not, you know, relative to what the situations that we're in. So I would like to hear your take on these.
I actually think that comes from it's a very toxic binary. This idea that you are either very concerned, grieving, or you're joyful and therefore careless. And I think it's fucking stupid, because one of the things that you learn when you actually also work with, for instance, people who have gone through incredibly traumatic migration journeys, for instance, is that when they're there and they find each other, they're joyful. And it's kind of, and I think that there are very different ways of, being serious about what you do without taking oneself seriously. And I think that actually being like, we have too much fun, this is a serious issue, is a very, very weird way of going about it. Because is the fact that everybody here is going to prevent themselves from smiling and all be in a dire, really depressive mood, is that going to help more the cause? Because if that's what we want to achieve, is to actually have the most impactful support for the Palestinian people, if the fact that everybody stops smiling is going to help, then okay. But really? Is that the fact? Is it really the fact that we're going to feel no joy? And I think that what it does is actually push towards an activist culture that is a burnout machine, that is non-regenerative, that is really dry, and it becomes self-policing. It's that because you can't have fun, you can't be comfortable, you can't be cozy, and then very, very quickly you can't use those terms. You can't do this, you can't do that, and I don't think that that's empowering. And I think that actually it is not about. And I think that there needs to be a lot of care and tact. Yes, I think that when you are dealing with an issue that is as profoundly traumatic as the Palestinian genocide, is that it is not about throwing any kind of party and not giving a shit. It's that's absolutely not what I'm saying. But I think that to actually have an injunction to be dour is really not something that I find is useful. And as for, we can't have a festival, it's already liberal, it's already too liberal, it's like, yeah, it's true. Let's have spaces that are really, really, dry and then wonder why people don't want to join them. It's like this thing about, oh, well, let's not have fun. It's really important. Let's not have food. Let's not have music because that's liberal. And then we're like, oh yeah, but and then blame people for not joining. It's like, I think that there are possibilities to actually have spaces that are, super welcoming and joyful, and and this idea that you don't want to be like normal people. I think that there is also a lot of, it's very condescending, I think, very often. Instead to actually say, well, because very often the logic is like, it's not going to attract the right people, like those who are going to come to the concert are not going to come for the right reasons, like as though every activist was born an activist, and as though the fact that you can have spaces where you come for a concert and actually you meet people and you read literature and you're like, oh wow, okay, so I think that that's, I think that it needs to be done with a lot of tact and a lot of care, but I find that these binaries are so toxic.
And deeply Protestant.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, deeply, deeply Protestant. You know, we're not allowed to have fun because we're born sinners, and you know, we have to wait till paradise till we, you know, have some fun, and it's rubbish. I mean, and also this idea of you can't hold two complex emotions in your head at the same time. Of course you can dance your grief. In fact, you know, if you look at the ACT UP and so on, you know, they often said, you know, we had people dying all the time. We'd go to one meeting, there'd be half the meeting wasn't there, but we would dance at night and we would celebrate our joy whilst we knew, you know, the people were dying. And Isa often watches the incredible film about the anti-apartheid struggle, Amandla. And if you've never seen that film, I mean, you know, people faced with extraordinary violence, going to the streets and dancing with this fierce joy, despite being shot. And yeah, I think if we look at many movements in the global south who have less been touched by white Protestantism, you'll see way more capacity to actually hold complex emotions and have joy in very, very, very dark times. And it comes also with a kind of idea of purity, and I think that's very dangerous as well. Purity is the kind of anti-chamber of fascism, and I think a lot of movements are kind of trying towards this kind of purity. We want to kind of be pure, and and that's equally, you know, problematic. And it's not. It's refusing the complexity again. It's refusing the diversity of the world. Once I produced a full color little booklet for the ZAD, just after we'd moved to the ZAD, and it was a booklet that was for people to give us stuff for the resistance, so, and showed you how to avoid police repression and so on. But it was in full colour, it was nicely designed, and an activist came up to me and went, "That colour, it deeply hurt my squatter soul, you know, I've always had black and white, I've never had colour, I was deeply hurt." I was like, wow, you know, like, why? I mean, like, you know, the sense that beauty is kind of liberal and bourgeois. I mean, go to any indigenous community anywhere who have no money, they produce beautiful things. Beauty is not a bourgeois concept. And so, yeah, don't get us on that one. We could talk for
Yeah, there's one more question.
I just wanted to add, like, sorry, a couple of sentences. It's like, my sense is that very often it comes more out of a sense of powerlessness than of a sense of wanting to be impactful. Is that I think that when you feel really powerless because you're seeing an issue, you know, and you know, it can be the genocide in Gaza, it can be, you know, the ecocide, it can be just like when you feel really powerless, is that there is a sense that at least if you align with your sense of powerlessness by being sad all the time, then at least there is some sort of alignment. And I think that calling for joy comes in my mind very much with also really having spaces for grief. And one doesn't cancel the other. And I think that, you know, and this thing about, we're comfortable and cozy, and that is not, you know, and it's like, well, okay, go and flagellate yourself with nettles, but, you know, how is that going to help? But I think that I think that very often it really much more comes from powerlessness than anything else.
I'm going to do one last question in the back, and then the rest I hope you will all stick around for a drink at the bar later.
Yeah, thanks for your presentation. It's very interesting, and I would like to go back, if I can, to the part about rural and urban situations, and it brought me to think of two examples that are urban, I think, but they're less intentional. If I can call the projects that you've described intentional, politically intentional, there's two examples from urban situations that I don't think are intentional. They are the Kowloon Wild City development. Have you heard of that? It is already, I think, maybe 20 years gone, but it was an organic movement of favelas in Kowloon, which is part of Beijing, if I'm not wrong. They were ordered to be abandoned, and the people initiated their own favela, but then vertically in a block. and it became a very, very solid block of small inhabitations and shops and etc. So it's organic and it's autonomous in a way. And the other one is the occupation of the Torre Finanzas in Caracas, where also deprived people inhabited an existing urban structure. And so these are, I think, it's according to your term, become the territory. I think they comply to that, but they're not as intentional as your project. So I was wondering if I could ask you how would you relate to those developments?
I'm not sure they aren't that intentional, I think. Really, I mean, I don't know. I haven't been to those places. I spent time in Argentina doing the uprising in 2001, and saw a lot of communities, you know, squatting buildings and taking over factories and running the factories themselves, occupying the factories, and so on. And that was. I think maybe I don't understand your term "not intentional," because. Are you saying that it didn't have a clear political, that the politics came out of the everyday necessity? Yeah. I don't see a difference, in a way, I think, between an intentional thing or something that emerges out of the necessities of everyday life and isn't necessarily labeled as intentionally political in that way, in a way. Yeah, and but I think it's a very, you know, these are beautiful examples, and I think for me, one of the questions is, you know, the city is such a machine of separation, separates us from everything, from each other, from our access to water, food, and what I think the one question maybe would be nice to end you with is, we're very inspired by an anarchist witch, an ecofeminist who's a friend and has trained us and has come to the ZAD a lot, who's called Starhawk. And she says that she has a definition of the sacred, which we really like, which is the sacred is not something you bow down to or you pray to. The sacred is something that you value, and you value it so much that you're prepared to defend it. And I think that, for me, is the big question in the cities. You know, how do we create cultures where we really start to be able to value the communities we're living in, the places we're living in, the land we're living on, and so on, in this big machine of separation? I think we'd like to end you with that. I think that's good. You want to say something? Fun.
Well, no, after you go.
Well,
so we're gonna end this.
Okay. Then a really warm applause. Thank you so much for this talk. Thank you all so much for coming. And yeah, I hope you stick around. I'll see you next time.